Part 1, Chapter 4 of Better Angel by Richard Meeker. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Better Angel by Richard Meeker. Part 1, Chapter 4. Kurt was in high school now. Being a freshman was not entirely pleasant, as it opened one more gate to his tormentors. They bothered him less and less, however, as time went on, and they found that their persecutions had so little effect. As far as the schoolwork itself went, there was very little difference. He had 4 teachers instead of 1, which made things more interesting, and there was the added novelty of moving about from room to room and not being kept the whole day in one square, chalk-dusty place. Barton High School was a small one. It had never had an enrollment proportionate to the size of the town. The factories were the cause of that. Their doors were always open for young muscles, strong bodies, nimble fingers, and the temptation of $12 each week, and the attendant independence that such a salary and such a life seemed to involve was a strong one. As soon as they were 16, many of them bought overalls and drill aprons and dinner pails, and became slaves of the whistle, as they had been slaves of the bell. Often, when Kurt had occasion to go on the far side of the river, where the paper mills and the shoe factory and the cabinet works were, he would see the older boys he had avoided in school, stripped to the waist, their bodies shining with sweat, moving through the weird scene of billowing steam and the acrid smell of disinfectant, pushing trucks of paper or snatching a breath of air at one of the open windows. It was a hot, unhealthy place, the paper mill. Beaters were the worst, reeking with steam and bleach, but it was all abnormally humid and odorous. In the sorting rooms, where fingers flew through bags of refuse and rags, or through long, grimy windows at the clicking stitching machines of the shoe factory, he would see girls who were not so much older than he. He would hurry past always, a little ashamed for them all, and for himself, somehow. So the school had never been large, nor had the teachers been particularly good. They were all quite young, most of them, recently graduated from one of the state normal schools or colleges. Some were a little rebellious at the fate that had planted them in so small a town, and so poorly equipped a school. Others were homesick. All of them were conscientious enough, but very few fulfilled Kurt's ideal for a good teacher, that she be interesting. His criticism, if he found her just, went little farther. At high school, too, the little clique with which Kurt had been identified all through school solidified and took on something of a social significance. Kurt's room in school had contained, from the time Kurt had caught up with it, in the 4th grade, a group of what Mrs. Gray termed unusually nice children. They were the children of storekeepers, mill officials, and professional people, all of whom, coming to Barton at about the same time, when its industries were opened, had settled there comfortably, and had children. By a wholly unconscious process of selection, the group had reached high school, with 6 boys and 6 girls, all of about the same age. The group formed always the nucleus of any activity of their class, and as time went on, they emerged from the 1st to the 2nd year of high school. Their importance became proportionately greater. Kurt belonged by virtue of his father's position in the town, and by virtue of something in him the children were drawn to, even when they teased him. In the circle he was popular enough, and partly because within it his fear of persecution was allayed, he was troubled hardly at all. There were frequent parties. The occasion would be a birthday or a holiday of some sort, and invitations would be sent out. Then, arriving one by one, or in groups of 2 or 3, they would come late in the afternoon. There would be a supper with plenty of jam and cake and ice cream. There would be an evening full of games, guessing games, or sometimes, depending on the hostess, romping games. And by 10 o'clock all would start for home. They would all go together, the girls in front, screaming and giggling, the boys behind, trying to tread on their heels, singing popular songs in cracked, uncertain voices, running ahead to hide behind trees where, by jumping out, they could elicit shrieks from the girls. One by one, the girls would be deposited at their homes, and at the last one, the boys would say good night. There would be shouted jests and taunts and chaffing as they went off singly or in pairs into the darkness, and the party would be over. There came to be a feeling of belonging. The little group was known to have the nicest parties. They were always at the head of things. They were, in the embryonic social life of the school, the elect. It was an unwritten law that if any one of them gave a party, the rest were automatically invited, and no one else was. That he belonged gave Kurt a deep satisfaction. It pleased something in him. It gave him a sense of superiority in one field, and a human one at that, which had been warped and thwarted in others. His home, with its books and music, increasingly his music, the school, the bunch, the church, these were his life. Home and school were the staples of it. The bunch and the church were its diversions. He believed in the church fervently, for it meant to him his hope of salvation. He had gone astray, and only through this new-old relationship could he expect to retrieve himself. Then, too, it gave him some chance of exercising his talents. He joined the Epworth League. He could play better than any of the girls, so he was at once elected organist. It was an office he enjoyed. He could discharge his duty, the simple one of playing 3 or 4 Sunday school songs during the course of the meeting, and reasonably expect to be exempted from participation in the rest of the service. Playing he didn't mind, ever. There was the organ. There were his fingers against the cold, firm keys. There were his feet pressing the wheezing pedals, something outside and supporting. He was always afraid, however, of being called upon for prayer or for comment of some sort. That was different. Occasionally he was, and his embarrassment at such times was painful. He found himself, as he walked to the church through the late afternoons, always formulating a prayer or a testimony. He might be called upon, and he must not make himself conspicuous. He must not disgrace the faith he had publicly accepted. He could now go to all these meetings at the church with the feeling that, whether he really belonged or not, in the eyes of the church he did. He had declared himself before a crowded church, so when questions came that a year ago he could answer only uncertainly, only with the guilty sense that he was cheating, he could now answer secure in the knowledge that no disbelieving eyes were watching him. Yet, could he? Why was he, without exception, embarrassed so terribly at these times? It was, he knew in his heart, without daring to let it come to the surface of his consciousness, because there was a doubt in him, a doubt of his experience. Could it be authentic, the great religious experience the preachers talked about so glibly? That exciting, ashamed, nervous feeling that had surged over him and carried him half against his will to the front of the church. There must be something more, must be, and he felt himself a hypocrite. All his life he had been pretending to things he was not, in order to simplify the task of living, pretending to be brave when he was afraid, pretending things his father and mother wanted for him, pretending to be sure when he was unsure. Not that he reasoned very logically about it. Feeling was too urgent in him. The whole situation, into which he found himself drifting, bothered him. But to accept the masquerade made things easier, unquestionably. And other people, too, he supposed, might behave similarly. The difficulty in this particular case was that he could not be sure whether it was a masquerade or not. When he looked at himself, he thought it was. When he looked at others in the church, in the Epworth League, he was not so sure. He was, he thought, as good, as sincere as they. He was not at all sure, either, whether it was really this newly accepted faith that helped him to conquer his evil habit. He liked to think so, but perhaps it was nothing more than fear, his overpowering fear of consequences. The frightening thing happened again and again. The medicine he had long since despaired of. Every night he went to sleep with the fear upon him, and when the tantalizing dreams would come, he was sickeningly reassured of his own guilt. A dozen times he determined to see the doctor. A dozen times he walked slowly past the doctor's office, determined to enter, but always the shame of admission prevented, and carried him past, sick at his cowardice. And then, in the summer, came relief. The Grays and the Bronsons had rented a cottage at the lake for the week of the 4th of July. They had all been swimming, and on the return from the beach, in the heavy flat-bottomed rowboat, while the older folks sought the cottage, he and Nob had gone into the boathouse to dress. It was a dark, cool place. The light came in only from below, through the shallow lake water, under the edge of the building, between the piles, with a strange gold-green color that wavered and trembled on the rafters with a liquid softness. They dressed slowly. Nob sat, dangling his toes in the water. Suddenly he said, in a choked, embarrassed way that was not his at all, "Say, Kurt, this is kind of funny, but, do you ever have funny dreams or anything at night? Kind of funny dreams?" Kurt knew. He said so, but little more. Nob, however, the ice broken, made it a confessional. The two of them, side by side, solemnly sat, forgetting to finish the task of dressing. Kurt said nothing except to give assent once in a while, when Nob would end a sentence with, "Do you too?" or, "All boys do when they get to be as old as us, I guess." Nob's experience had been so much like Kurt's own that he could hardly keep from crying for sheer relief. Nob had been more fortunate, though. He had addressed his question to Dr. Brody, who wrote a health column in the Detroit paper, and had received a little book which answered all his questions. "It just happens when we get so old, and it won't hurt us any. Gee, wasn't I glad to get that book! You can have it if you want, when we get home." End of chapter 4, end of part 1.